Welcome to the deep dive. Let's get straight to it. Making good calls.
Yeah. Super important.
It's fundamental, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our lives, in many ways, are just a collection of the choices we make.
Mm-hmm.
And when you really boil it down, what shapes our journey? It seems like it's two things. Plain old luck, which, we can't touch.
Right. Totally outside our control.
And the quality of our decisions, and that's something we absolutely can influence.
That's the crux of it, yeah. We're not in control of every gust of wind, maybe, but we can definitely learn to adjust our sails.
Nice analogy.
And that's precisely what we're navigating today, boosting the effectiveness of our decision-making.
Exactly. We've been really immersed in Annie Duke's How to Decide. Simple tools for making better choices.
Great book, really practical stuff.
It is. And our aim today, really, is to understand how to elevate our decisions by focusing on how we make them.
The process.
The process, yeah, rather than just, obsessing over whether the result was what we wanted.
Right. Did I win or lose? That's not the whole story.
Not at all. So we want to equip you with insights to sidestep some common mental hurdles, like this thing called resulting
Mm-hmm.
and the oh-so-sneaky hindsight bias.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking this idea of resulting. What's the core of that?
Well, at its heart, resulting is basically judging how good a decision was based purely on the outcome.
Just the outcome.
Solely, yeah.
Yeah.
So a good result automatically means it must have been a good decision, and a bad result means, oh, that was a terrible choice.
Okay, I see.
It's kind of like judging, I don't know, an entire football game just by looking at the final score.
Right. You miss all the strategy.
Yeah, the near misses, the unlucky bounces, maybe some brilliant plays that didn't quite pay off. All that context gets lost.
That resonates. Think about a friend who takes a flyer on some, hot stock tip,
Okay.
and it blows up. They make a fortune. Were they suddenly a financial wizard?
Probably not, right? Could have just been lucky timing.
Exactly. And conversely, you could spend weeks researching a major purchase, maybe a car or something,
Mm-hmm. Weighing everything up.
meticulously.
Yeah.
Weigh every pro and con, make what seems like the most rational choice based on everything you know.
Right.
And then it just falls apart for some reason you couldn't predict. Was your process flawed just because the outcome was bad?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, there's a huge amount of randomness of just, luck in the world.
Okay.
A really solid decision process definitely increases your odds of a good outcome over the long run.
Right, over time.
But it doesn't guarantee it every single time. And a lucky result can easily mask a, frankly, terrible decision-making process.
So we have this kind of built-in tendency then to tie the quality of the result directly to the quality of the decision itself.
We really do. We crave that neat connection.
And as the book highlights, this desire for that neat, tidy connection,
Yeah.
well, it can really trip us up.
Big time.
So here's where things get, I think, really interesting. How does this drive, this need to link outcome and decision, actually lead us astray?
Well, this longing for a predictable world, where good choices always lead to good things.
Yeah, if only.
Right. It kind of sets the stage for this cognitive glitch, this bias called hindsight bias.
Ah, okay. Hindsight bias.
Yeah. So once something has actually happened, we often get this powerful feeling, this sense that we knew it all along.
Ooh, yeah.
Even if, that wasn't really our belief at the time, before it happened.
Right, our memory plays tricks.
Exactly. The reality of the outcome sort of retroactively colors our memory of what we knew or believed before.
Ah, the old Monday morning quarterback syndrome. Everyone's suddenly an expert after the game's over.
That's it, exactly.
Oh.
And hindsight bias shows up in a couple of key ways, according to Duke.
Okay.
First, we start to genuinely believe, truly convince ourselves, that we did anticipate the outcome. Our memory just subtly shifts itself to line up with what actually happened.
Okay, so we rewrite our own history bit.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
And second, we develop this feeling that we should have known what was going to happen.
Even if the info wasn't there.
Exactly. Even if the information available beforehand didn't clearly point in that direction at all, we still feel like, I should have seen that coming.
Can you give us a tangible example of this playing out?
Yeah.
Something concrete.
Absolutely. The book points to the 2016 U.S. election as a really striking illustration of this.
Okay, yeah, I remember the predictions then.
Right. So leading up to it, the national polls largely suggested a popular vote win for Hillary Clinton,
Hmm.
but several key states were known to be very close, sort of toss-ups.
Right, the swing states.
Exactly. Places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. While the margins were tight, the polls generally showed Clinton with, a slight lead there.
Okay.
Then, when Donald Trump won those specific states, and therefore the presidency,
Yeah.
a narrative just exploded almost immediately. She should have seen it coming, or, the campaign should have known, particularly about supposed polling errors in those specific states.
Yes, I definitely remember that. The post-election analysis was intense. How did the polls get it so wrong, etc.?
But here's the thing Duke points out. Polling errors are really only identifiable after the votes are counted. You can't spot them definitively beforehand.
Good point.
And there wasn't really widespread, solid evidence before the election of huge, systematic polling errors just in those specific states. I mean, the national polls ended up being relatively close to the final popular vote count.
Okay, so the national picture wasn't wildly off.
Not really. So the question becomes, how could the Clinton campaign have definitively known before Election Day that the polls in those particular 3 states were significantly off?
Right, when other polls seemed okay.
Especially when, other data wasn't screaming massive error here. The book argues that based on the information publicly available at the time, it's pretty unlikely they could have known with any certainty.
But afterward.
But afterwards, the she should have known and the it was obvious all along narratives became incredibly powerful.
That's hindsight bias.
That's hindsight bias in action, yeah. It distorts our perception of what was actually knowable before the event happened.
That's a really powerful example.
Yeah.
It shows how knowing the result just completely warps how we see the decision-making landscape beforehand. It makes things seem inevitable.
Totally inevitable.
So, okay, if our memories are this unreliable, this malleable, what's the countermeasure? How do we fight back? How do we build some resistance to hindsight bias?
This is where some really practical strategies come in. Annie Duke suggests using what she calls a knowledge tracker.
Knowledge tracker, okay.
Which is essentially advocating for journaling as a really powerful tool. She calls it a kind of vaccine, actually, against hindsight bias.
A vaccine for faulty thinking. I like the sound of that. I'm definitely on board. How does this knowledge tracker work then?
The basic idea, the fundamental principle, is to actively write down what you know before you decide.
Okay, so not after, but during.
Yes, during the decision-making process itself. It's about capturing your assumptions, the information you're actually relying on, your reasoning, your level of confidence, all at that specific moment in time.
So it's like creating a little time capsule, a snapshot of your brain state at the time of the decision.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. By documenting your thought process, the data you looked at, maybe even your uncertainties, you create this concrete, tangible record, something you can actually go back and look at once the outcome is known.
And that helps how?
Well, it makes it significantly harder for that sneaky hindsight bias to creep in and just rewrite your memory of what you actually knew, or, importantly, what you could have reasonably known at the time.
Right, because you've got the evidence right there.
Exactly. The very act of writing it down, of being deliberate about it, creates a much clearer timestamp of your knowledge. It makes that, oh, I knew it all along, feeling much less convincing when you can see what you actually wrote down beforehand.
That sounds like a really valuable practice.
Yeah.
Seriously useful. So instead of just like mentally running through the options in your head, we should either be putting pen to paper or, fingers to keyboard to really log our thinking.
It makes a big difference.
Okay. What's another way then to get a more maybe objective handle on decision quality, especially after the die has been cast and we know the outcome?
Another really insightful technique in the book is this idea of reassembling the tree.
Reassembling the tree, like a decision tree.
Exactly. So after an outcome has occurred, like we said, it can seem totally inevitable, like it was the only possible branch, the only thing that could have happened.
Yeah, that one outcome suddenly looks huge.
Right. But at the moment the decision was actually made, there was almost always a whole range of potential outcomes, different branches on that tree, each with its own probability, however small some of them might have seemed at the time.
Right. It's easy to forget all those other possibilities, those roads not taken, once we've arrived at one particular destination.
So true. So the exercise here, the technique, is to consciously visualize, or maybe even better, actually sketch out a simplified decision tree.
Okay.
You start with your decision point. You definitely include the outcome that actually happened. That's one branch. But then, and this is key, you actively brainstorm and add other plausible outcomes, things you considered possible or should have considered possible at the time you made the choice.
So we're deliberately forcing ourselves to remember and visualize those alternative scenarios that didn't end up happening.
Yes. Precisely. It helps you put the actual outcome back into its proper context.
How so?
Because an unlikely outcome, even if it does occur, was still just one possibility among others before it happened. It was maybe a thin little twig on the tree, right?
Yeah.
But hindsight has this way of making that single twig look like the main, thick, inevitable bough of the tree.
Ah, I see.
So by reconstructing the tree, adding back those other potential branches, we resist that urge to give far too much weight to the actual outcome when we're judging the soundness of the original decision.
That makes sense.
It helps you remember that improbable stuff happens sometimes. That doesn't automatically make the decision that led there bad.
That's a really powerful mental image, that tree. It stops us from letting the one outcome we know retroactively change the odds of what was possible in the first place.
Exactly.
Now, the book also talks quite a bit about the importance of adopting a specific mindset when we're facing decisions. Can you tell us about the archer's mindset?
Yeah, the archer's mindset, it's a really helpful framing. It's basically about shifting your focus away from needing to hit the bullseye every single time,
Right, getting that perfect outcome.
and instead focusing on the deliberate process of aiming, which means making an informed judgment, an educated guess, based on whatever information is actually available to you at the time.
So accepting you might not have perfect info.
Exactly. It recognizes that perfect information is often, maybe usually, impossible to get. But crucially, it stresses that even incomplete knowledge is still valuable.
Something is better than nothing.
That's the idea. As the book says, having some information is almost always way better than having none at all.
So it's about valuing the effort, the process we put into making an informed guess, even if that guess doesn't turn out to be perfectly accurate in the end.
Precisely. And there's a bonus. The very act of taking aim, of trying to make that educated guess,
Yeah.
it actually compels us to critically assess what we do already know, and just as importantly, what we don't know.
Okay. It highlights the gaps.
It does. And that awareness then naturally motivates us to seek out more information, to try and learn more, to fill those gaps if we can.
That makes a lot of sense.
So the archer's mindset really boils down to asking yourself two key questions when you're facing a decision.
Okay, what are they?
First, what existing knowledge can I leverage right now to make my guess more educated? What do I already have?
Right, take stock.
And second, what additional information can I reasonably find out that will make my guess even more educated? What's worth looking into?
I like that a lot. It feels very proactive. It puts the emphasis squarely on preparation, on information gathering, on the process. Rather than just passively waiting to see if you got lucky with the end result, it makes the whole decision thing feel less like a gamble and more like, like aiming.
Exactly. It feels more skillful, less passive. And to kind of synthesize these principles, to put them into a really practical approach, the book lays out a 6-step framework for making better decisions.
Okay, great. A practical framework is always good. Let's walk through those 6 steps.
Sure. So the 6 steps are, step 1, identify the reasonable set, the range of possible outcomes for the decision you're facing.
Okay, like a branches on that tree.
Exactly. Step 2, figure out your preferences. How much do you like or dislike each of those potential outcomes? Get clear on your values there.
Right. What matters to you?
Step 3, estimate the likelihood, the probability of each of those outcomes actually happening. And the book stresses, don't shy away from making your best guess here, even if it feels really uncertain. Just put a number or a range on it.
Okay, got to take a stab at the odds.
Yep. Step 4, assess the overall picture for this option. Look at the relative likelihoods of the outcomes you like versus the ones you dislike. Get a feel for the balance.
So weigh the probabilities against the preferences.
Precisely. Step 5, repeat steps 1 through 4 for any other viable options or choices available to you. Do the same analysis for each alternative.
Compare apples to apples, kind of.
Kind of, yeah. And then finally, step 6. Compare the overall evaluations of all your options based on that mix of likelihood and preference, and then make your final choice.
That's a really clear, structured approach. It definitely reinforces that deliberate, less purely outcome-focused way of thinking we've been talking about this whole time.
Exactly. By consciously working through these steps, you're forcing yourself into a more rigorous process. You're considering possibilities, understanding your own preferences, assessing probabilities.
You're doing the work.
You're doing the work. And this ultimately leads to decisions that are, on average, more likely to serve you well in the long run, regardless of the immediate outcome of any single choice.
So really, the big takeaway here seems to be that while we can't dictate luck, we absolutely have agency, we have control over how we approach making decisions.
That's it.
By prioritizing gathering information, by thoughtfully considering various scenarios, by accepting that uncertainty is just part of the game,
It always is.
we can make better decisions over time. And it's just crucial to resist that powerful urge to judge those decisions only based on whether we happen to get the result we wanted that one time.
Precisely. It's about, understanding these pitfalls, like resulting, and actively working to counteract the effects of hindsight bias using tools like that knowledge tracker.
Yeah.
And the mental exercise of reassembling the decision tree after the fact. Focus on the process quality.
This has been incredibly valuable, really illuminating. It really makes you stop and think about how often, probably unknowingly, we fall into these cognitive traps.
We all do it.
Yeah. So here's maybe a final point for you, the listener, to consider. How might a conscious awareness of resulting and hindsight bias start to reshape the way you look back at decisions you've already made? And maybe more importantly, how might it change how you'll approach the decisions that are still ahead of you? Perhaps take a moment later to think about a recent decision you faced.
Yeah.
And just reflect. How much might the outcome you got be coloring your perception today of whether it was actually a good choice back when you made it?
That's a great exercise.
Something to chew on. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.